Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This talk was actually supposed to be taking place sometime in November, actually beginning of November. One of the fellows here had a schedule that nobody could catch up with, so we had to wait till today. So if anybody is responsible for a Ukraine crisis to erupt so that this could be a more appealing meeting, he's sitting to my right. I have no responsibility in that. And that's usually what the Bulgarians did under the Ottoman Empire as well. They have always done something with the Russians and keep the Ottomans in trouble. Anyway, welcome. It is true, we are witnessing a period of fragmentation and probably reshaping, hopefully, of a world. And in some of the movies, like Inception, it really come to mind. Somehow fiction precedes reality. But this was, in a sense, in the making as well. Again, Ivan and his longtime colleague, Stephen Holmes, wrote a book called The Light That Failed, which basically was a wonderful, in my judgment, a very insightful reflection on a moment in 1989 or a moment at the beginning of the 1990s that was taken, or that was taken by Europeans and Americans, not as just a moment in a historical flow, but basically the determinant of the flow for a future that was not even identified at the time. But of course, there is always a novelist to remind us how foolish we can be when we try to give meaning to a historical moment. And in this case, I would cite William Faulkner, who said, "The past is never past. In fact, it's not even past." And in a way, the past is catching up with us, and that moment of elation, or perhaps that moment of hubris, is finally coming to an end. And I think the challenge, beyond the challenge of the moment, which is the Ukraine crisis, which may go one way or another, I have no idea, is not really what will happen with this particular crisis, but whether or not after nearly 30 years of rather complacent and passive observing status almost by the Europeans, in spite of some objections to that posture, if Europe actually can lift itself to a position where it can actually react to those developments, reshape itself, and actually remain a relevant actor. Again, in this room, we had a meeting about a couple of months ago with the representatives of some foundations, and one of the ideas that was brought up was really whether the future of Europe would be a future worthy of its past, or would Europe actually become a continental-size Venice, which means a nice place to visit, take snapshots, admire, eat, and then go back home. Okay, so the Ukraine crisis, symptomatic perhaps, is more a Europe crisis than it is a Ukraine crisis. How it will resolve, how Europe will respond, and what will remain of the transatlantic alliance at the end of it are obviously going to be very consequential for the future shape of world order. Arguably, it will finally have destroyed the security architecture of Europe that prevailed since the Cold War ended, and something new is going to emerge. That something new may look very much like what it was before, let's say during the Cold War. But if Russia actually prevails, not necessarily by invading all of Ukraine, but making sure that Ukraine is more an appendix to Russia in geopolitical terms rather than an independent country with capability to behave in the international scene autonomously, then Europe will be faced for nth time, perhaps, with the challenge of a continental power weighing in on everybody's strategic calculations and actually being a threat. That threat between 1871 and 1945 was Germany. And Germany in this crisis, of course, plays a very interesting role. And it takes us, and their position today takes us back to a debate that many people, I think, have forgotten back in 1989 and 1990. When the wall fell down, Europe was faced once more with its perennial German problem. But the German problem could have gone two ways. One was, oh my God, they'll be reunified and we'll be faced with the same problem that we had in 1871. The alternative view was, oh my God, they're going to go neutral and we will not actually be able to build a security architecture because at that time, remember, the Soviet Union was still around and the collapse of that empire was not really foreseen by almost anyone. The behavior of Germany, and I have to now respectfully refer to a lecture given here, again, exactly almost 2 months ago, by German diplomat and advisor to the German president, Thomas Bagger. In an exquisite presentation, painstakingly detailed, with attributions, with references to debates, current debates and history, Bagger basically suggested to us all that whatever our expectations as the audience were from Germany, to actually rise to the occasion and take the leadership of Europe, because it was absolutely and desperately needed, that Germany, for reasons that he has cited, would not be able to do that. And in fact, what we're witnessing today is that Germany is acting as if it were a neutral country, is acting as a country whose only interest is business interests. It is as if it wasn't an American president, but a German politician who said the business of X country is business. And even the coalition government within itself is incapable of coming up with a coherent strategic position that everybody could understand and perhaps adjust themselves to. And that, I would think, is the single most important weakness of Europe as a strategic actor today. And what we see is that without Germany, Europe cannot really become an autonomous actor, a goal that the French president seeks so passionately, has been talking about so passionately since he came to power. On the other hand, I find it a bit odd that when this crisis is still simmering, the French president speaks to the European Parliament, talks about Europe's strategic autonomy, but in the same breath, he also wants to go to Russia, talk to Putin, and engage the Russians with European strategic calculations or goals. That suggests that within Europe there is a lot of confusion. Now the question therefore for me is, why is there such confusion and what is at the roots of that confusion? Partially it is, as I said, the complacency of Europe, definitely for the last 30, or the best part of the last 30 years, but perhaps probably longer, since the end of the Second World War, the relaxed, kind of relaxed attitude or being under American security umbrella. But there is something larger that is happening. And again, Krastev and Leonard for the ECFR have also identified parts of what is happening beyond the military and the geopolitical. And that is the world that the West, Europe-centered West, with its extensions across the world, has created is actually crumbling. Again, the film Inception comes to mind. An order is crumbling, a narrative is crumbling, and they have been weakening for some time. That is happening along three trajectories. Economically, back in 1980, China, with 1/5 of the world population, represented about 1.5% of the world economy. Today, China, with 1/5 of the world population, represents anywhere between 17 and 19% of the world economy. This is a massive shift in the distribution of economic power. And with such a massive shift in economic power, obviously comes a shift in the distribution of political and geopolitical power. And of course, that is the second dimension on which we're witnessing this erosion of the grip of the Western world on world politics. And finally, there is the cultural and ideological one. Globalization served the non-West, and particularly China, wonderfully. This is irreversible, and in a way, actually takes us back to a historical reality. We tend to forget that throughout most history, China was the largest economy in the world, and in fact, as late as 1820, it represented by itself 1/3 of the world economy. It lost its leading role, its leading position in the world economy, despite industrial revolution, only in 1870 to the United States, which by that time represented 7% of the world economy. Okay. Now, but the economic power shift, which is not, by the way, as absolute as it appears, because if you add Europe, the United States, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the volume of economic strength of the West and its Asian extensions is larger than China and Russia, and that is not really going to go away anytime soon either. But there is a new economic dynamic that already led to this geopolitical power shift. And one can identify the turning points of these, and I will mention 4. One was, of course, Western assistance to China's economic growth during the heyday of globalization, and in a way, the greed of companies, let's say, were more important than future geopolitical plays. Second, the Iraq War, then the financial crisis, and with those, the West claims to lead shattered. On the ideological and cultural front, weakness in economy and hard power, combined with perceived confusion, pusillanimity, incompetence, and lack of will and divisions, along with resistance to cultural domination that Krastev and Leonard identified, weakened the West's grip that spilled over to its political system and ideologies. When we talk about the backsliding of democracy, why it is no longer as attractive, the loss of soft power, this is really a function of all those things that happened and the punctuations in those particular deaths that I just cited. Trump exacerbated those trends. He widened the intrawest cracks. He showed or displayed both incompetence and bigotry, and certainly was not someone who was committed to democracy or liberalism, and culturally moved the US away from a unilateralism that it claimed only perhaps after the Second World War. Welcome, therefore, to the world that Sam Huntington, and not his doctoral student, Francis Fukuyama, has actually described. It was interesting because when Thomas Berger did speak here, and in an article that he's written, I think 4 or 5 years ago, he identified Germany as the country that embodied the aspiration that Francis Fukuyama's now classic and probably much maligned article, The End of History, actually predicted. Instead, we have Huntington's world, not just in terms of clashes of civilizations, but in terms of how globalization would lead to the rise of the non-West, and that the politics of cultural resentment between the West and the ex-colonial world would intensify as material differences between the West and the non-West would narrow, the alternative consciousnesses would arise, and therefore the Western as the universal was not going to be an axiom that was accepted by the ex-colonial world, which had now its own material wealth and certainly its own different consciousness. In a way, historical memory has returned, and the Western moment is relativized. So what about the United States? We can look at the United States, and I think not doing it is wrong, or we must look at the United States, not just in terms of what it can do as a global power, because the United States, in spite of everything, does remain a global power, but can we really analyze America as a global power and American foreign policy without looking at its domestic politics? Of course, this is a very classic debate in international relations theory. We tend to analyze states' behaviors independent of their domestic politics, but it seems to me that at a time when only continental size powers are going to remain relevant in world politics, we cannot dismiss or we cannot belittle the importance of America's domestic politics for analyzing its international behavior or its foreign policy either. Now, it's always a good exercise, and it makes us feel very good to dump on Trump. I would submit to you that much as he deserves to be maligned and, I don't know, insulted and all that, he really is not the person responsible for the current state of American power. The decay in the US, the self-destructive reflexes in American foreign policy began far more spectacularly, in my judgment, under President Bush. And already, by the way, in the 1990s, just when the Cold War ended, the Cold War societal consensus and the social contract that existed between American elites and the American public, for the American public to support the policies of containment, the allocation of resources to containing the Soviet Union, massive military expenditures and all that. That social contract was actually under fire, under a lot of pressure, and actually was breaking up. Globalization, the choice by the American elites to arrange the political economy of their country along globalizing lines was a major factor in weakening that social contract. And as that was happening in society in the 1990s, for those of you who are old enough to remember the debates over NAFTA and the resistance to NAFTA, and the fact that in 1992, one of the reasons why George H.W. Bush lost the elections was one slogan by one funny-looking businessman, Ross Perot, who said, "When I hear NAFTA, I'm hearing a giant sucking sound of American employment towards Mexico." And in America's recent history, no third-party candidate has gotten 19% of the vote, as Ross Perot did in 1992. No Ross Perot, there would have been no Clinton administration. Okay. Anyway, but beyond that, within American Congress, especially from 1994 onwards, the unilateralist streak, the non-internationalist streak was also getting, I'm terminating, but do I have time?
No, I am not the Terminator.
You are the Terminator, yeah.
No, you have your 7 minutes.
Okay. The Bush administration and the neocons, who did not particularly like the more internationalist but nonetheless guarded approaches of President Clinton, took a criminal act, which was 9/11, judged it a strategic challenge, and responded to it strategically. And obviously that wasn't well thought out. That was not really well aware of the world's realities, and the response, not necessarily the one in Afghanistan initially, but the one in Iraq, the choice that they made in Iraq, and the singularly incompetent way of how they handled Iraq, harmed the US on at least 3 levels. One, it seriously weakened the legitimacy of American power. 2, it displayed America's helplessness when confronted with asymmetric warfare. And thirdly, it depleted America's resources in the quest for transformation or domination or transformative domination in the Middle East. Now, because of how crass Trump was, one forgets how Rumsfeld was so dismissive of Western European sensitivities, or at least German and French sensitivities about abiding by the rules of a so-called rules-based system. It was Rumsfeld who came up with the division in Europe between New and Old Europe, and actually invested in Eastern Europeans, the way Trump would later do as well. So, and Europe, of course, was as divided then as it appears today. With Obama came a period of retrenchment, arguably a policy that recognized spheres of influence. In that famous article, The Obama Doctrine, Obama treats Ukraine as the backyard of Russia, which he considered basically a regional power. And I guess Putin then promised to prove Obama wrong. And then, of course, there was the pivot to Asia, which obviously Obama thought was the far more pressing priority of the United States. And in the meantime, the United States military, which actually prepared for itself for 2 simultaneous wars and had the capability to fight 2 simultaneous wars, no longer has that capability. It can no longer, that's why the pressure on Taiwan, on the nerves, and on Ukraine simultaneously also leaves the Americans a bit helpless. And that's why, and that's probably the only reason why they still think they need the Europeans and they cannot find, beyond the rhetoric, the support that they expect from the Europeans to come. Okay. I'll have to skip things, running out of time. Domestically, the urge for isolationism in the United States is very strong. And if anything, that is what Trump has actually demonstrated. The Obama approach in the pivot to Asia, which of course had this dimension of containing or balancing China, was a subtle one. Trans-Pacific Partnership, you bring about a set of important economies and therefore diminish the dependence of all those countries in Asia on the Chinese economy. What does Trump do? On the 4th day in his job, he actually scraps the TPP and leaves it, or the United States leave it. And that was part of the choice of confrontation and an America that would engage only when it so fit. And that decision, in my view, or that direction has not yet been consolidated in the United States. The United States would need allies in order to fight with the Chinese. Then the question that should be pertinent for the Europeans is the following. Yes, in withdrawing from Afghanistan, the Biden administration showed that it didn't particularly care what the Europeans were thinking. Yes, in AUKUS, they were dismissive of France and only later on decided to catch on. Their behavior in the Ukraine crisis suggests that they know they are weaker than before and therefore they really do need the Europeans on their side. But if Europe cannot respond in kind, is there a threat, and that's a question to all of you as well as myself, is there a danger that whether NATO stays in place, the troops remain in place, the United States will finally say, okay, I don't have to be here. I really have other and much bigger fish to fry, and that is what I'm going to concentrate on. And already you can see the Pentagon doing that. I'm not going to give the figures, but the Pentagon is now heavily investing on technology because economically China is going to pass the United States in the next 5 years. Instead, with the demographic lag and with the economic lag, the Pentagon invests in technology, kicks the Chinese out from the technological universe that the United States is building, is fighting the domination of Huawei, but as I've heard yesterday, they cannot even convince Hungary to actually kick Huawei out when it comes to 5G. Therefore, it's a long struggle, and increasingly, if the Europeans will not play, the Americans may just decide to withdraw and fully concentrate on Asia. I do not know whether they will do that, and certainly not now. Okay. And that, and final point, therefore, come back to the beginning, that really puts the onus on the Europeans. America will be around economically and as a global power. It does have the technological wherewithal. Although its demography is beginning to change, its birth rates are not as high as they used to, it can still hold its own demographically. It can always rely on Latin America if it can ever be managed or governed properly. It will have a very serious problem with its own domestic politics. It is a divided country, extremely polarized country, and strong political actors that are trying to exacerbate, deepen that polarization, which then basically locks up the country. So for the future competition between China and the United States, the term Cold War may not be appropriate in a lot of ways, but it may prove to be totally inappropriate in one particular dimension. Between the Soviet Union and the United States, or between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, between the West and the socialist camp, there was a clear ideological difference and political difference. Democracy was, however perfect or imperfect those democracies were. A United States led by Trump in 2024, or a more competent Trumpist, with the help of a Republican Party that has become certainly an anti-liberal and definitely a white supremacist party, can the United States actually appeal to a world that is arising, that is awakening, and pretend that it can lead them on the path to democracy? But for Europe, therefore, the challenge is going to be twofold. One, can it finally devise for itself a strategic identity? You need Germany for that, which doesn't seem to be terribly interested. And second, let's assume that European Union does get its act together, Germany is on board. Can Europe by itself carry the burden of keeping democratic spirits, liberal democratic spirits alive? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Soli asked several interesting questions. I'll try to go with the first one on my side, and then I'll go to open the discussion. Because one of the things that really strikes me is that if you want beyond simply the Russia-Ukrainian relations, I very much agree with you that it's about the nature of the post-Cold War European order. And if you see the discussions in Geneva that started, Russia, and this is quite interesting, Russians see COVID as a kind of a mark end of a certain period.
As what?
This was the end of a period. I mean, from this point of view, they have a much more, they see it as a war that has ended. I was on a conference in Sochi months ago, which was called COVID as a Substitution for War. And this is quite important because this idea that European order is in crisis, and so it's not a new idea. We've been discussing it quite a lot. But in a certain way, for many reasons, basically this is kind of a, you have a post-war order without a war. So post-COVID world is a world which in their view is very different than the previous one. And here I agree very much. When you see the discussions between the Russians and the Americans, there is ambivalence which is particularly intriguing. Russians invited the Americans on a funeral. Let's discuss basically the end of the Cold War European order, reverse and go back to the 1997. I'm saying this without Europe. Americans said, oh yeah, we're coming to visit a sick patient. And we believe that we all are interested to improve his health. The same international order. So in a certain way, both kind of sides negotiate without recognizing the same kind of a reality. For the Russians, that something has ended. for basically the Americans, it is a crisis, we should improve, something should be done, and I very much agree with you that Americans very much insist not to be stuck in Europe. Why I'm asking this question? Because the biggest paradox in my view of European order, and here I want to address you, is that European Union is kind of the big animal in this European order, but it was never part of its creation. In a certain way, this order made European Union possible, but European order was very much negotiated between the Americans and the Russians. This is why you have this strange situation in which Europeans, we don't know what to do. Russians and Americans are negotiating about something that they have negotiated back in the 1990s. And when Europeans try to get a much more activist position like Macron, it does not always seems very kind of consistent. So from this point of view, is there possibility for European order which is centered on the EU without being guaranteed by the United States or being guaranteed by the United States in the way it was not guaranteed today? For me, this is the biggest question, because if this is the case, we obviously see the emergence of a different international order. European order is going to be very different than the Asian order, in terms even of the normative values, in terms of basically what keeps the countries together. It's much more anti-China hegemonic alliance that Americans have tried to be in Asia. The problem is that European Union is such a normative player that can it survive in an order which is normatively different than the post-Cold War European order? This is my question. From this point of view, European Union is not a normal state. So the United States can go this way or that way. You can like it or dislike it. They can go liberal or illiberal. We can like it or dislike it. But in a certain way, it's a classical state. And they can be part of a different international order, classical realism too. And this is why I find your German question an interesting question, because Germany is the embodiment of the success of European order. Thomas Bagger, who gave this talk here, he said something which in my view was very revealing. He said, the end of history was an American idea, but a German reality. And in a certain way, what was this order is economic interdependence as a source of security. Germany totally benefited from the opening of the economies. Germany trades with China more than they trade with the United States. And then comes the idea of a sphere of influence, and I see some serious economists here. What is the meaning of a sphere of influence? For example, during the classical Cold War, being in a sphere of influence means having ideological kind of affiliation, but also basically tell me with whom you are trading, and I'm going to tell you in which basically sphere of influence you are. Is this the case now? Or to what extent, for example, sphere of influence is much more data sharing? Tell me with whom you're sharing your data, and I'm going to tell you where sphere of influence is. So I'm asking all these stories because for me, the real question, which I do believe you're also asking, is European Union as a European Union, can it survive in an international or European order which is different than the one that we have now? For example, can European Union be an effective player in a much more realist policy environment, even if the German leadership decided basically to have a different policy? Or is it going to be fragmented to the nation states that have been there?
It is basically the question that I was trying to raise, but phrased differently. The European Union, of course, was a creation of the Cold War. It was, to a certain extent, not fully. I mean, although the French took the lead for European integration, it's another French person who took that integration not as it was originally intended, but as an instrument for his nation's, to make up for his nation's lack of ability to actually act as a major power. That's Charles de Gaulle. And then, of course, that particular formula whereby the Germans would keep on paying and the French would call the shots politically, ended when the wall fell. And in my judgment, the European Union was not able to make the transition in its own identity from being a product of the Cold War to being a product of the post-Cold War. In a way, partially this was because, and that was also the idea in the United States, that there would not be another war in Europe. Nobody expected Russia to come back from its ashes, and they were wrong. So in that sense, I think that was the big miscalculation. There was nothing in the debates of the late 80s or during the 90s, looking at Yeltsin and stuff, that there would come a time when Russia would actually be resurrected as a major power and would say, history is back, I am back, what are they going to do about it? Neither the Europeans nor, I think, the Americans were prepared for that. And even when the Americans colossally failed in Iraq, and therefore actually paved the way for what they now complain about Russia. I mean, you go to Iraq without a UN Security Council support, and you have no right to actually complain about what the Russians are doing. That doesn't mean what the Russians are doing is right. It's just that at that level you cannot really question it. And what's very interesting is that Russia is indeed a declining power, but it's vast. It has a lot of arms. And it has one thing that the Europeans don't. It has, for better or worse, will to power. Okay. And against that, I really find the efforts of Emmanuel Macron respectable. And I kind of sympathize with him because he's helpless, because he cannot, and it seems like he will not find a German partner. So if then the European Union, qua European Union, cannot do anything beyond economic unification, then it will be strategically not a player, definitely, an observer maybe, but that will probably also have a negative impact on its economic unity as well. Yesterday, again, in this room, we talked about, the first panel we had was about Chinese, how shall I say, influence in Europe, investments in Europe, and how they also follow a project, they also follow a plan. They know what they want, and they do what they think they need to do in order to get what they want. And it appears there is no counter power or counter projection or counter strategy, either individually or collectively among the European Union members.
Thank you very much. Then I'll go to the colleagues and to their question and comments. But I'm very grateful for your explanation, because my story is, it's not about the will only. It was really a project which was a post-war project in two different ways, European project. One, the result of the end of the war and Cold War, but secondly with the idea that war is not possible in Europe, not in the world. So Europeans, we're not. And then the story is, and when others are going, why Russia? Why not China? Russia is not the only revisionist power in the world. By the way, Turkey is a kind of a revisionist power too. So from this point of view, why it is Russia taking the initiative for reordering and so on, and China is kind of closing itself, staying home, waiting. Because in my view, the story of declining power and rising power is part of the trap in which we went. If somebody is a declining power, it means that tomorrow you're going to be in a weaker position than today, and then it makes sense to act today. If you believe that you're a rising power, basically you can wait. So this is but this was part of the questions, and I am very much open.
That's what Duclos and Goldman say, that China has time, but Putin is in a rush.
Yeah, please. So please feel free to comment to question.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, maybe both, or whoever picks up the question, about the role of the Great Britain, because you mentioned both that the European project, the European Union, is a post-Cold War project. But in fact...
No, post-World War II project.
Sorry.
Post-World War II.
Aha, okay. So, because in my view, it is also the question, the European project was to diminish the power of Germany, right? And there, Great Britain jumping out of the project made it much more difficult for France to keep going, but also Germany is like, I mean, you wanted us to have less power, and now you want us to have power and to speak up for us. So, coming back to my question about the role of Great Britain and the EU and cooperation.
Okay, I'll give you a convoluted answer. One, the rise of Germany as a great power after World War II also speaks to some structural realities. If you have, at the very center of Europe, a country that is full of hardworking people, or people who can be organized in such a way that they will be working very hard, invent things, produce things, and whatever, no matter what you do, you're not going to prevent that from happening. And it is also true that German prosperity, German economic growth was also very important for the United States, for the rebuilding of Europe. So whether you like the Germans or dislike the Germans, it didn't really matter. They came back, as did the Japanese, with some help from the Americans, but they came back. When I was preparing for this, I've read more things perhaps than I did before about the dynamics within Germany. And already we were beginning to see that this fear of German neutrality in 1990 obviously was a rather learned one, because many Germans are now moving in that direction, especially if they are young. Antipathy towards the United States is immense. Therefore, what the political system still clings onto, at least in rhetoric, and what the public is willing to support are two different things. That's number one. Number two, already with Merkel, and I would suspect that probably from Schroeder, when Schroeder and Chirac opposed the Iraq War, that must have begun, that you really cannot trust the Americans, because at the end of the day, they will not listen to us. And with Trump's rather crass attitude, impoliteness, is insulting behavior and stuff, I guess that finally really percolated to different segments of the German population. So you no longer have in Germany, which was the most pro-American country in Europe itself, the same type of social understanding or consensus that America is the way to go. Do they have an answer to the question, okay, if America is not the way to go, which way do we go? That I think they don't have either, and that's the tragedy, if you will. So in that sense, Britain was also, I mean, this is a bit metaphysical, it will sound. Britain kept Germany bound westward. And I think it was Thomas at some point in a maybe private conversation said, cut off the British tie, we drift towards Moscow. Again, this is metaphysical because obviously countries don't sail, but geopolitics have a certain dynamic, and that may very well be it. It also reminds me of a professor of mine, a Czech professor, who immediately when the Cold War ended said, there will be no security problem in Europe if there is a Berlin-Moscow entente. And so long as there is none, there will be a security problem, or it will be invented. And his argument was at the time that all those countries that wanted to join NATO were actually doing a disservice, because that would create in due time the instability that we're now witnessing. And Britain, by the way, yes, it you know, it comes up with this, what he called the tabloid version of what the Russians are trying to do in Ukraine, you know, plant a prime minister in there and all that. I don't think they got their act together. I mean, they presumably leaving the European Union was going to make them the global Britain. It made them a global joke. They are still clinging on to either the transatlantic relations or basically their vast historical presence in certain places. But I really don't see them playing a determining role in any of the things about the future that we've discussed. And who knows, do you think that the Brits at some point might want to return to the EU with Brexit turning out the way it is?
I don't believe this, but I do believe your question puts, at least for discussion, something that I find very kind of structurally important. When people start talking about the emergence of a new order because of the new constellation of economic powers, also military powers, Chinese are investing quite a lot and so on, everybody believes that Americans and Chinese are going to act and others are simply going to adjust. And my major argument is that in crisis like this is the middle powers that get totally nervous. And listen, this is the Brits. They go to Australia with the Americans to show relevance. By the way, they went very close. If there is a Western government closest to the Ukrainian government at the moment, it's not the Americans, it's the Brits. Because you're trying to keep relevance. And where we probably disagree, I don't see Germany drifting towards Russia, honestly speaking. I see Germany drifting around itself. It's not that Germany is drifting around Russia, just the opposite. In a certain way, Russia is profoundly disappointed with Germany. We see the end of the special relationship. Germany is not delivering anything of the things that Russia wants. On the other side, of course, Germany is not siding with the United States in the way they have been siding before, because structurally, Germany is not trying to understand what is their role in a world which is different than the one that they know. And in this other world, for them, security was based on interdependence. The more you're trading with somebody, the more secure you are. So Nord Stream 2, and I have been part of this discussion for quite a long time, was basically sharp and framed by the Germans as the way to increase our influence over Russia. They said, listen, they depend on us buying their gas much more than we basically are depending on them buying their gas. And the most important is that we are also allowing Russia to stay very disciplined with us. This is changing, and in a certain way, for me, the dark side of economic interdependence that can bring security but also can bring insecurity, this is the changing game. And then the lack of hard power. So Great Britain used to be very important for the EU also because it was a nuclear power. Listen, it's a they have a strategic culture. For example, they know where China is. You're joking, but I'm not sure that Bulgarians, we know where China is. No, we know that it exists. But in the Bulgarian geopolitical imagination, nothing goes beyond Ural. No, but I'm saying this with a sympathy. Listen, this is a small states. Okay, I'm using Bulgaria. Do you believe that Belgium has a kind of a strategic culture? And they're worried about Taiwan? Can you see the foreign minister of Belgium not sleeping because of Taiwan? But Brits are getting pills, sleeping pills because of Taiwan. So from this point of view, part of the problem of the European Union is also this is a combination of a small and mid-sized countries, and some of the mid-sized countries are also becoming small in a new world. And with the exception of the France and UK, you do not have a single country with a classical strategic military culture. Germany was pacified and demilitarized and so on and so on. But let's not use, because there were several questions and remarks, so let's go to the colleagues.
I have the microphone, so I will go next. Thank you. A couple of questions and maybe a provocation. The first question is, you know, crises have the habit of clarifying things and clearing the mind. And it's true that domestic politics has a serious influence on foreign policy, except that tends to be trumped at times of crisis. So I'm wondering to what extent this crisis, assuming it does not erupt into a horribly violent war, will clarify within German minds what the role is that they will play. And opinion has shifted over the years on Germany's particular geopolitical and European role, and this might also catalyze it a bit further. The second is, I think it was Ivan that said this, I mean, Russia is just, it's a regional power, right? And it may be large, but this is a case in which size does not actually matter. And if you look at it in economic and other military terms and force projection terms, it's, you know, it has regional ambitions for a sphere, and these were actually hindered or hurt badly in 2014 with Maidan, because that actually upset Putin's plans. So in some respect, this is a continuation, an attempt to redress the loss that Russia suffered in 2014 when Ukraine turned west. Then finally, the provocation. We are sitting in Austria, and I come from Switzerland, so I couldn't help but wonder why a Ukrainian Strait Treaty of 2022, modeled on the Austrian neutrality or the Finlandization, so-called, of Finland, or other neutral status, might not be the appropriate way out of this particular crisis, because there's no earthly way on which European or American lives are going to be sacrificed for the Ukraine itself. And there's no way in which the Ukraine is a credible, potentially future, in the near future, member of NATO. That's a promise that I think is not going to be lived up to. And so why don't we go for an option that might actually resolve the crisis and satisfy both parties? And I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that one.
Look, I mean, it's a bit of an absurd situation. Russia gobbled up Crimea, and everybody protested. Sanctions were imposed, and obviously nobody is going to fight for Crimea, and nobody is going to fight for the Ukraine either. It will be like Hungary 56 or Czechoslovakia 68. Okay, so under those
Ukrainians can decide to fight for themselves.
No, the Ukrainians may decide to fight, and then the Americans and others may decide to actually help the Ukrainians fight Russia and give them a hard time. Suggestions along the lines that you've just enunciated are being made in the press. Whether or not they are being read or taken into consideration, I have no idea. Maybe Ivan does. But for instance, one idea is give Donbas autonomy. It is part of the Minsk agreement, some people argue. And that lifts the pressure from Russia to a certain extent, because it balances pro-Russia and Ukraine's whatever it wants, and then basically get the Ukrainians to either formally or informally commit that they will not try to join NATO. Will that give the Ukraine the capability to remain a truly sovereign and independent nation is the big question. I'm sure the pressure is going to be on them, but maybe that will also give them the opportunity to pull themselves together. A French commentator, Dominique Moissy, who is a rather serious person, in his latest piece wrote about a rumor that he said was credible, and my hunch is he probably heard it by one of the protagonists. In a meeting between Tusk and Putin, apparently they take a walk, the two of them, no interpreters, no translators, no one. And Putin basically tells Tusk, look, Ukraine is not a real country. Why don't we divide it up again? Anyway, the western parts of it belong to you, right? About 200 miles. You take it back, and then we'll deal with the rest. So if that is the mindset, you cannot really ever be sure that they will leave Donbas or no Donbas, they will leave Ukraine alone. And then it's a question of, do you put morality, principles, values, or whatever ahead of geopolitical realities? You really cannot fight the Russians. How long can you go on? Can you continue to support the Ukrainians, fight the Russians if there is an invasion, without that is spilling over to the western parts of Europe and basically disturbing the peace and quiet and security there? So questions are abundant. I'm kind of hoping that the Americans behind the scenes may be trying to convince the Russians that we will get to that point, but just don't do anything drastic. And I haven't yet read anyone, and I don't know Russian, and I don't have too many Russian friends, Ivan does, Does anybody really know what Putin actually wants to do? Did he get what he wanted? Or does he have to really move in before he gets what he wanted? What do you say?
Yeah. One more, and then I'm also going to take, but after that, please. Yeah, you're.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to make 2 or 3 observations. The first is about will. Russia has a GDP which is smaller than the GDP of Italy, maybe the size of Spain. So the idea that a country of the size of Spain, as you said, becomes a superpower or something like that, or a regional power, something like that, that's interesting. So it's about will. Yeah, if the Europeans would see a threat from Russia, like the Israeli, for example, they could, set up an army that is 5 times the Red Army or something like that in material investment. This brings me to the next point. It's not so that the Europeans are not investing in the military. The expenses of Europe, of all European armies, is about 40 to 50% of what the US is doing. The only thing the Europeans are not getting out of that is firepower. Yeah, because the Europeans, every European country has a military industrial complex. Even the Austrians buy Austrian whatever personal armed vehicles, despite the fact that they are too old and hopefully will never go to war because they're more dangerous than the ones that you could buy on the international market. But this saves Austrian jobs, and so every country has that. Yeah, and I mean we see it with every debate about helicopters and fighter jets and the next generation of drones and things like that, that we are investing in there's no economies of scale in our investment. And so apparently, but this might have to do with the fact that Russia is not seen as a threat by many. So the question is, why should we invest? So if we invest our taxpayers' money, it's going to save jobs and bring votes and things like that. And so the next observation would be, when you say it's not a threat, why? In many European countries, and it's particularly true for Austria and Germany, almost all political parties except the Greens are in favor of Russia. Yeah, mildly or strongly, Austrian politicians of all kinds, more liberal ones, more conservative ones, social democrats to the left, to the right, are working for Russian companies, see themselves as envoys of Russia, goodwill and things like that, give interviews to Russian media outlets, even least credible ones, and so on. In Germany, if you would have a vote in the Bundestag, probably an open vote, you might not get a majority for sanctions. Yeah, and it's appeasement. And Ukraine, I mean, Putin rightly calculates that we lack the will. Yeah, and as you said, the both of you, I don't know, maybe Ivan, we're not gonna, European lives are not gonna spend in Ukraine. So then the question is, Putin getting what he wants? I think, in my view, it's clear what Putin wants. He would like to undo the independence of Ukraine, because this is the Potemkin project of Novorossiya and taking it back from the Turks. In this case, taking it back from the West. And then a 200-kilometer strip where Ukrainian nationalists who might start a guerrilla fight, something like that, will be given to Poland and or to Slovakia or to Hungary or something like that, or have an informal autonomy or something like that. Might be a credible, I mean, we will probably not agree on that, but this could be a solution in realpolitik terms. Now, what it would mean for Europe, and this is probably also plays into Putin's cards, because it's just a few kilometers away from here, I don't know, 5 million refugees, 10 million refugees, something like that. It could have a huge destabilizing effect on the liberal democracy in Europe, just by the sheer numbers of people. You can walk literally within a week from Uzhhorod to here. Yeah, I mean, it's, Uzhhorod is closer than the Lake of Constance or Zurich, yeah, to something like that. We don't realize. Same with Berlin. So I think it has implications where you can say, yeah, maybe Putin is in a rush, but he can wait for another, he's going to be in power till 2034, something like that. 36, something like that. So he might be in a rush, but he is not completely in a rush compared to European politicians who are facing, on average, re-election challenges in 2.5 years from now, every time, yeah, if you take the average. of 4 or 5 or something like that. And so I think it's interesting to see that the Crimean Peninsula is at step 1, yes. But when you see why are we not serious about sanctions, nobody has ever sanctioned Israel for annexing Palestinian territory. I've never heard. I mean, there's this de-invest and whatever, disinvest campaign, but this is a fringe NGO movement. And the difference between the Crimean Peninsula and the Palestinian territories is that the vast majority of the Crimean population is happy with annexation. The vast majority of the Palestinian population on the West Bank and the Golan and East Jerusalem is not happy with that annexation. And you will find more people in Ukraine, probably no longer a majority, but you will find more people in Ukraine who would accept an annexation to Russia if this would improve their economic standards and living standards, things like that. I mean, maybe the intricacy or the bad part of the game that Putin is doing now is that he's alienating more Ukrainians than winning over. The anti-Russian feelings have been increasing in Ukraine over the last 1 or 2 years under this pressure. So the sympathy that was there for Russia and for common culture and speaking Russian, etc., things like that, which were, at least in the eastern part of the country, definitely there. I think they are getting smaller. And so by trying to bully Ukraine into a kind of a semi-dependent status, he is losing the population. But what this means and whether these people would be ready to start a guerrilla war like after 1945, we remember the war in Ukraine was over only in 56, 57, something like that, when the last white Ukrainians were, either killed or kicked out or sent to detention camps or something like that. Whether this would be a scenario that would emerge is something that remains to be seen. And this would depend on whether Lviv and other western parts would remain under sovereign control, and you could start, could be a back base for freedom fighters that would immediately be labeled terrorists from the other side. Okay, so you could then have a kind of a Northern Ireland scenario for parts of the country or something like that. Yeah, I think these are possible scenarios, but something that would impact us most is 5 million refugees from there arriving at our gates with a probably very ambivalent Western European population, maybe a little bit more accepted than Muslims from Afghanistan, but I'm not sure about how many would then definitely be welcomed. And this would probably not immediately stop if living conditions would not improve immediately in Ukraine. I'm sorry to feed you with more questions than answers, but these are my considerations around that. So it's about the will, it's about public opinion on our side, and I think it's about refugee and other implications that could hurt our liberal democracies at least as much as giving in to Putin. Okay, sorry, but who wants the mic now?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to say something, and then I'm going to give Soli the right to summarize and answer all of your questions. One is on neutrality question. And it's an interesting question because this country have been neutral already. If you go to the constitutions of all post-Soviet republics, with the exception of the Baltic states, all of them basically put neutrality as part of their constitution. The problem is that in order neutrality to be well-functioning, like Austria and Switzerland, somebody should be ready to respect it. And from this point of view, the crisis of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, listen, Ukraine used to be the second after Russia European country with most nuclear weapons in 1993. One of the biggest negotiations that Americans did was to convince Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons. And then basically they lost the territory. And I agree, Crimea was contested, and it's not an easy issue, but this was their territory. So from this point of view, the problem of neutrality is that while it sounds extremely attractive on many a level, there is only one legitimate actor that can suggest this, and this is the Ukrainians themselves. If Zelensky today goes and says, we are ready for Finlandization, which means much more preferable economic relations with European Union, but demilitarization, believe me, Americans are not going to be against. What they cannot allow is the Russians to make it. And I do believe this is part of the problem, is that exactly because it is about the emergence of new order, it's much more symbolic politics. And secondly, the idea that, by the way, with refugee flow, it's also quite interesting. We can be surprised by a very different reaction than normally you expect with the refugees, because in a country like Poland, where people believe that this is extremely anti-migrant and so on, and you remember during the refugee crisis, do you know that Poland, in the period between 2016 and 2019, was the EU member state that received the highest level of labor migrants? There are almost 2 million Ukrainians working in Poland. So from this point of view, even for a country like Bulgaria, which is now a huge depopulation, even the Austrian media discovered that we have been reduced to 6.5 million. Ukrainians are one of the basically foreigners that you are going to be quite open to get. And because Eastern Europe has been very much depopulated because of cultural and other reasons, the problem is different, and this is why, and because going to Soli, the very nature of the European project and the very nature of European order centered on the EU was the EU was a project with open borders. We declared that European order can become a global order. We can go anywhere. Anytime the French president is asking about the borders of Europe, you remember, anytime the French asked these questions, we said it is a legitimate question, because anybody who wants to join European Union can do it. And in a certain way, European Union was behaving as being surrounded by future members. This was the idea of the European Union: Turkey, Ukraine, and so on, and so on. So this was the order. And in a certain way, what the Russians very much are contesting now is this. They're asking the question, where is the border? And the border is basically what you are ready to defend. On the other side, Ukraine is a big country. I was listening to a lot of stories about, listen, 100,000 Russian troops on the border cannot occupy Ukraine. Nevertheless, how non-heroic the Ukrainians could be. If you see the size of the country, it's slightly bigger than Austria, with a lot of people living there. So from this point of view, size matters in all these negotiations. And I very much agree. I cannot see a single Russian soldier entering Lviv, because it is not perceived as part of historic Russia. And I'm going to add up before going to Soli, because when you ask the question, what does Russia want, we always believe that it's very secret, that they're never telling us, and they're very deceptive. In a strange way, just the contrary. Russians are very open and very literal. They're telling us what they want. To be honest, it does not mean that we should give them what they want. But from this point of view, there is not much of a secret. If you read the essay which President Putin personally wrote in July last year, this is there. Listen, in a certain way, he's saying there is a historic Russia. By the way, nothing about the restoration of the Soviet Union. Putin is not dreaming for getting Kyrgyzstan back. He wants to have Kyrgyzstan part of its sphere of influence. They want basically to have in Central Asia and get Americans out. He's even not dreaming to get Kazakhstan back. But, and this is my last point, the demographic fears is something that we always do not take seriously in all this kind of a power calculation. 2 weeks before Mr. Putin published his essay, he gave a direct line with the Russian public saying if it was not for the 20th century, with all this crisis, with basically the revolution and then disintegration of Soviet Union, there were going to be 500 million Russians in the world. 2 weeks after he published the essay, he had a meeting with the students from one of the Sochi school. He again came back with the 500 Russians. These missing Russians is extremely strong for something thinking in terms of civilizational space and sphere of influence. It's not about territory, it's about people who are our people. And the worst that this can happen is to make out of the Russians Ukrainians. And this is, in my view, part of the story that you see very strongly in this kind of a very brutal effort is why he's doing it now. Because in 10 years, you're going to have a generation of young people who get out of schools who do not speak Russian language. Full stop. By the way, you see it in Central Asia already in many of the republics. You're going to see a Ukrainian army which is going to be better trained and better armed. And this is why I'm quite pessimistic that everything is going to be so peaceful, because if President Putin is going to stop now and do nothing, next time he will try, the costs are going to be higher. Even now, Ukraine is better armed. Even now, basically, you have these constellations. So this is a strange negotiations in which it's not this time that Americans are not interested in Finlandization, for example. They don't want to be part in Europe. They really want to go to Asia. But they cannot come with this initiative. And on the other side, the very legitimacy of the Ukrainian state comes from the fact that they're never going to suggest Finlandization. And this is where we are, and this is why the negotiations are so difficult. And this is not only about Ukraine, this is about many of the countries, but sorry for, and we're going to the, now truth is going to speak. Soli.
I have no idea if Putin would be, I mean, I don't doubt that he did have that conversation with Tusk. As I said, Moisi could only have heard it from either Tusk, his wife, or his cousin. So I was surprised to read that.
Sorry to say, but Tushman and Milosevic, in fact, had that conversation, if you think of the map.
On Bosnia, over Bosnia.
We all have these conversations on a dinner parties.
But I don't know if Russia can really afford to actually be the initiator of border changing in Europe, because once those things start, you never know where they will end. And it's not as if, and if there is a demographic problem, there is a demographic problem to the south of Russia as well. Yes, one problem that he has is that he does not have enough Slavs, but the other side of the coin is he has a lot of non-Slavs who are not going to be terribly happy, perhaps in the next 10 years. They already had a pretty bloody Chechen war. So he has you can say that he's tried it in Georgia. You know, Ossetia and Abkhazia are presumably independent. So he did change the borders, but maybe that was less conclusive or consequential than what a similar thing might be if it's tried in Ukraine. Second, I think, I mean, migration problem, obviously, if 5 million people show up on 2 weeks or in 2 months, it may be a problem. But given the fact that Europe, every part of Europe, desperately need more people, and they'd rather have them to be lighter rather than darker, and probably carrying crosses rather than crescents, it may not be as bad. It's just if it's massive and it is in a very short period of time, it would create a lot of problems. But I suppose the Ukrainians who would leave also would be people who are relatively better educated, better skilled, and what have you as well. That is not a totally unmanageable problem, except for if it happens on a massive scale. As for, but then the way Ivan threw the ball at me again suggests the following. The Europeans will have to be doing this. They're not even at the table now. Are they? Isn't that what they're complaining about? That the Americans and the Russians are talking, and the Europeans are not really there. And part of the reason why they're not there, they don't have a unified position with which to negotiate. Either to offer bribes, threats probably they cannot, and that it comes back to the original question: what will Germany do? And to that, I mean, again, we had an answer, and I am not in a position to question Thomas Bagger's rather convincing conclusion that the Germans are not going to do anything. And that's a pity. That really is a pity. But I also do not see, honestly, a protracted war that the Russians can actually engage in. Not only because 100,000 people will not be enough to occupy or to control all of Ukraine, but sooner or later, no matter how much money he may have on reserves, this will backfire on him domestically as well. He can prevail over his own domestic opposition, obviously, that I don't doubt, but this is not a tenable thing. And one final question that I'd have in mind, is the Russian elite unified behind that particular project? Are they?
I don't know, but I have a great poem, which this is why I took to read you, the children's poem, which in my view really beautifully summarizes the conversation that we have. And the poem is the following. The grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and marched them down again. And when they were up, they were up. And when they were down, they were down. But when they were only halfway up, they were neither up nor down. And I do believe this is, this is the situation in which we are. Thank you very much, and let's thank you. Sorry.